Hello, welcome back to Vizru's walkthrough series once again. Here with, my name is Ben, here with my co-host Milan, and today once again we have Justin, who is our product manager here at Vizru, and he'll be continuing to take us through the workflow walkthrough that we started in a previous video. So Justin, I'll turn it over to you and go ahead and take us through it.
Yeah, so hey guys, so we now should have a basic understanding of a few workflow blocks, right, from the last session. In this session, we'll focus on a few basic but important actions that you can take to interact with the spreadsheet via workflow. So the blocks we'll go over today are the spreadsheet update, filter, increment, and insert block. So what we'll want to do is create a workflow that executes whenever a new task is added through our form that we created a few sessions ago. Okay, so the first thing we'll do with that is with that workflow is to update the task ID against the record we're adding. So I've created a spreadsheet here that will help us accomplish that, called primary key lookup. Okay, so it has two columns, increment key and increment value. And the idea is that the increment value will get assigned to a newly created task as a task ID. Okay, and then increment by 1, so it's ready for the next task. And since we are incrementing a numeric value, let's go ahead and make sure that we set our data type to numeric. Okay, so let's go over into workflow. And let's call this workflow demo add new task. Great, so we'll start to get parameters. Go ahead and label this entry as a best practice. And we'll go ahead and save. Okay, let's do one more thing, which is enable the workflow log. Make sure that's enabled. Okay, great. So now let's create a new task. So let's go to our form. Sorry, before we do that, let's assign this workflow that we just created to execute whenever a new task is added through the form. Okay, so we'll get into edit mode. We'll locate our form. And then over here on the left, under after save, go ahead and choose the workflow that you just created, demo add new task. So essentially what this is doing is telling the system whenever this form is saved, go ahead and execute this workflow right after that. Okay, so we'll go ahead and select that workflow update.
So there we're just kind of assigning an order of operations, right? So it's that task is updated and then that is telling it to kick off that workflow.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
So we'll go ahead and add a new task and we'll just fill in some random values. Okay, so once we save, we see our new task pop up here. And then if we go into our log, we'll see that it executed. Beautiful. And notice how all the fields that I entered are actually passed to this workflow, right? So one important variable here is called row ID right here, which is essentially an identifier for the new task that we just created. So each row in the spreadsheet has a unique row ID, which can be used to perform actions with the spreadsheet blocks, okay? So what we want to do now is pull in the next task ID from our primary key lookup spreadsheet, update our new task with that task ID, and then increment the task ID value by 1. So first we'll use a filter block to actually retrieve the latest task ID. So the way to do that, we'll hit edit, and we'll bring in our filter block. Okay, so the filter blocks are used when we want to extract data out of a spreadsheet, whether it be a single row or multiple rows. So we'll call this filter counter, and we'll need to select our application, and our spreadsheet. So our counter lives in the primary key lookup. Now in the filter column, we'll filter where the row is, or we'll pull out the row where the increment key is task ID. Right, so this is my column and this is the value. So if we go back to our spreadsheet, I'm saying grab the column, increment key, where we see the value task ID, right? So it's going to pull in both of these data points. Okay, we'll go ahead and save.
And I saw, if you just go back to the filter block, actually, I saw there's some advanced settings as well. What would those be used as? Just kind of like
Sure.
limit from.
So the filter block has advanced settings that help you filter out the data in a specific way that you would like. So enable for large data. So if this is used, or typically this is used when you're trying to query large amounts of data at one time. So for an example, if you had a task list with like 1 million tasks and you wanted to try to filter the contents from that, you would have this option enabled for better performance.
Okay. And it's just kind of, those are all just different ways to filter it, I guess, is what you're saying, right?
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
The row count actually is a little unique. That will only return the number of rows that you're trying to filter.
Oh, okay.
Limit from and to is useful if you want to trim the count of the filter. So for example, if your filter produces 100 results or 100 rows, but you only want one, you could put in 0, meaning 0 is the least amount of records you can get, and 1 is going to be the max, right? So it's a floor and a ceiling.
Okay, got it.
For column alias, so this is useful if you want a particular column to take on a different name in the workflow. So for example, we have a column in our task spreadsheet called task name, right? Mm-hmm. If we wanted this to be represented as task in the workflow, we could say task name as task. And we could do multiple columns here by separating them by the comma. So for example, if we wanted task ID to just be ID, we would do something like that.
Okay. So, and there's no other unique, I guess, punctuations there. It's just, you could say task name as task, and it's just separated by comma. There's no need for brackets or anything else there.
Correct, yeah.
Awesome.
The distinct column is used when you only want to extract out a specific column. So our task spreadsheet, if you remember, has about 10 columns or so. If we only wanted to filter out one column, we could specify that here. So if we were looking for the created date, for example, then this filter would only return the results for the column under created date. Okay, and then the sort does exactly what you think it does. It's used when you want to sort the results from the filter in a specific order. So suppose you wanted to get a list of all of the tasks sorted by task ID. So you could add task ID here. You can have it ascending or descending based on your preference. So if we wanted all the task IDs starting from lowest value to the highest value, then we'd select ascending, and then we could just add that here.
Got it. Okay.
Okay. Cool. Okay, so let's see, we have our filter. Let's go ahead and re-execute this workflow and take a look at the log. Okay, so this is what we're expecting in the entry block. And then now if we take a look at the counter, we'll see it pulled in one row, right? That has 3 variables. Of course, every row in a spreadsheet will have a row ID. But we have the task ID, and now we have the increment value 101. Okay. All right, so next up, we're going to update the task spreadsheet with this task ID. So let's go ahead and pull in spreadsheet update block, and we'll go ahead and connect that. We'll give it a label and we'll say update task ID. And then we'll go ahead and select our app and spreadsheet. We'll be looking at our task list. So here in the filter column, we'll use the row ID. So we get the row ID from the entry block, right, to indicate which row we want to update. And then we'll go ahead and save. And then we'll go to the connection mapping. And what we'll want to do is select our column. So this is our task list spreadsheet. These are all the columns. We'll go ahead and select task ID since that's what we're updating. And we're getting that count from counter, right? So we'll say counter dot increment value. We'll go ahead and save. Okay, now the last thing we want to do is increment that count by 1. So we have a block here called spreadsheet increment column. Go ahead and bring that in. Okay, so it's going to be in the primary key lookup, and the column we want is going to be where the, let's see, what is it? Our increment key is task ID. Okay, so this is the row we're looking at, and the column specifically is going to be increment value, right? So every time this block executes, this increment value will go up by 1. All right, so let's go ahead and save and re-execute the workflow. Okay, so the current counter is 101. If we go into the update block, we can see that it was updated. That's our spreadsheet name. And then the fields that were updated. So here, and then of course our filter down below. So we see that now this particular task that we just entered, the task ID was updated with 101. If we go to the next block, we see that the increment value is now 102. Right, so let's go into our spreadsheet. Well, let's refresh this one. So this one went up by 1. And our task list spreadsheet, we see this is the task that we just entered, and it was updated with task ID 101.
Got it. So this is updating that task ID. So then, as you see in the workflow, right, the next one, it's already saying 102 because that's what the next one would be if it's executed again.
Exactly, yeah.
Awesome.
Now we'll take a look at the spreadsheet insert block. So let's assume for a second that we wanted to keep track of every task entered into the system in a separate spreadsheet that will only be used for auditing purposes. So I created a spreadsheet called task audit over here, and this is identical to our task spreadsheet, right? So now in our workflow, whenever a new task is created, we'll go ahead and add a spreadsheet insert block and then insert that task into the task audit spreadsheet, okay? So this is the spreadsheet insert. We'll go ahead and connect it and open it up. We'll select our app and spreadsheet. Notice how this block doesn't have a filter option, right? And that's because we're not looking for an existing record, but rather we're adding a brand new record in, right? So we'll save, and we'll go ahead and select all of our columns to update.
So this here, like you said, you're selecting the columns, just to confirm, you're selecting the columns that you'll be updating on that spreadsheet. That's what this connection mapping is.
Exactly. So we're creating a new row in the audit spreadsheet, And then we're going to populate these columns in that same row using the original task that was created.
Okay.
And so this is fairly easy because we already have everything we're looking for in the entry block, right? We have the task ID. Sorry, not the task ID. So the task ID is a little different. We have everything else, right? So the task ID we'll be getting from the counter. Okay,
yeah, that's right.
Counter.increment value, and then everything else we'll just pull from the entry block. All right. So once we've added all of our variables here to update, we'll go ahead and say save and close, save, and now let's add a new task. Through our form again, we'll say maybe this is task 2. Okay, so task 2, then we'll look at the workflow to see exactly what happened. So our counter is 102. We'll update that task, that same task ID. We'll increment the task ID count, and then finally we'll insert all those values into the task audit spreadsheet, right? And then we can see the fields that were actually added. Okay, so if we go into our tasks audit spreadsheet, we can see that this got added here. And then our original insertion for task ID 102 is also here in the task list spreadsheet. And then so now I'll show you an example really quickly of Vizru's internal variables. So Vizru has a list of variables that you can call to help you get information like who ran the workflow, what is the name of the tenant that you're running the workflow in, to get timestamps, things of that nature. So in order to demonstrate this, let's go ahead and use a block we haven't used before, which is the notification. So in the action section, we'll go ahead and pull in a notification block. And essentially what this is, once this workflow is done doing all its work, we'll go ahead and send a notification to the front end and display a message to the user. Right, so we have a bunch of notification types. We'll go ahead and say success. And notice if you first type a curly bracket, you'll get a whole bunch of options here, right, for the template variables. So we can get the name, right? So login username, this is going to show the name displayed here, right? So this was executed by Justin. So login username will display Justin. Login user email will display my email. So maybe we'll have both of those and we'll say added a new task. Go ahead and save. Okay. So now what will happen is if we create task 3, the workflow should execute that notification block and give us that notification. So let's save. So we see in the workflow, the template variables, right? We see that I put in the curly bracket, the login username, converted to Justin Coy, and then the login user email changed to my email, right? So those are a few of the internal variables that you can use. Another one is timestamp. So extremely useful if you're trying to track the time. So let's say that you wanted to track the time from when the task was created to when it was marked as completed, right? So you would take a timestamp from when the task was created, and then you could create logic and say, okay, if a user marks a task as completed or done, take another timestamp, and then we could take the difference between those timestamps and figure out, okay, how long did it take for this task to complete?
So all these things seem like they're very useful for customization, but then also just kind of providing more details in terms of, that personalization of the name or the email, and then also, as you said, the timestamp. That's very useful, especially for a task tracker or a task management application that we're building here.
Correct. Yes.
All right, awesome. Thank you again to Justin for walking us through the second part of the workflow content today. That's all from Milan and I for Vizru's walkthrough series, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.